The topic of today's lecture is traditional food systems and food processing. Pictured here is a Peruvian farmer processing some of his oca tubers by soaking them to remove toxic compounds. This is one step of a lengthy process that includes soaking, freezing, and drying tubers to make them more nutritious, more palatable, and to transform them to a long-term storage product. This week, we'll discuss traditional food processing techniques like this, as well as the traditional food systems of which they are part. The film Gather does a better job than I could ever dream of doing to illustrate major themes about traditional food systems. So in order to prioritize time in favor of watching that full-length film, in this lecture, I'll just touch on some of these themes that you will find there and in your readings. After that, we'll look at the family of the week, do a quick overview of traditional food processing, and zoom into the traditional food processing technique of fermentation. You've now all read and learned about traditional food systems through the examples assigned for this week. Some overarching themes I'd like you to reflect on as you connect the many stories of traditional food systems you've encountered are the following. First is that traditional food systems are the result of generations and generations of interactions between people and their environment. Second, that traditional food systems are valuable to communities not only for their nutritional qualities, but also for their significance to culture and identity. Third, that the integrity of many traditional food systems has been threatened by a complex interplay of forces, including colonialism, racism, and violence. And fourth is that people around the world are revitalizing their traditional food systems and, in so doing, healing and strengthening their communities and land. And mentioned throughout Gather, as well as previously in the course, is the term food sovereignty. I wanted to take a moment to unpack this term and provide some historical context. The concept of food sovereignty was introduced to the public by a group called La Via Campesina during the World Food Summit in 1996. Quoting from their website, La Via Campesina is an international movement bringing together millions of peasants, small and medium-sized farmers, landless people, rural women and youth, indigenous people, migrants and agricultural workers from around the world. Built on a strong sense of unity, solidarity between these groups, it defends peasant agriculture for food sovereignty as a way to promote social justice and dignity, and strongly opposes corporate-driven agriculture that destroys social relations and nature. The term food security was introduced in 1974. At the time of the World Food Summit in 1996, the UNFAO described it as follows. Food security at the individual, household, national, regional, and global levels is achieved when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. La Via Campesina recognized that food security, defined as such, was missing any mention of the social control of the food system. So they introduced the term food sovereignty as a precondition for the existence of food security, not so much as an alternative term as it's so often used today. At that time, they described food sovereignty as follows. Food sovereignty is the right of each nation to maintain and develop its own capacity to produce its basic foods, respecting cultural and productive diversity. This term was, and very much continues to be, an alternative to neoliberal policies. As it has become more commonly used and redefined by many groups, it is often expanded beyond food production to include people's right to define all aspects of their own food and agricultural systems. Now let's look at the family of the week. The family of the week this week is the Brassicaceae, or mustard family. When learning about plant classification, we talked a lot about what unites this family botanically. One key feature was their four parted flowers, which form a cross. The reason why this family is also called the Cruciferae, and its vegetables known as cruciferous vegetables. In the context of plant domestication, we also talked about how there are a few species in this family that have been domesticated and bred to create many distinct vegetables, as is the case for the Brassica oleracea vegetables, including kale, collards, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi. Today, our focus will turn more toward food and nutrition, and we'll be celebrating these foods as we transform them to sauerkraut. The chemical compounds that distinguish plants in the Brassicales order are glucosinolates, which release pungent mustard oils when crushed or chewed. Remember, order is the hierarchical level above family, and other families in the Brassicales order that share these mustardy flavor compounds include the Tropiolaceae, think nasturtiums, Caperaceae, think capers, and Caricaceae, think papaya. Their seeds have a mustardy kick. Glucosinolate compounds have many health benefits, with much research investigating their role in digestion and cancer prevention. These compounds also, or should I say first and foremost, have an ecological role to defend against insect pests, and their levels are influenced by environmental factors. This is why, when my mom decided to grow an entire raised bed of arugula and did not care for it properly, the arugula upproduced glucosinolates to take care of itself, and my mom's resulting arugula was too spicy to eat. I chose to highlight the Brassicaceae today because they lend themselves well to lactic acid fermentation, the type of fermentation resulting in kimchi and sauerkraut. Some of the reasons for this are because large amounts of lactobacillus bacteria are found on their surfaces, they retain their crunch well, and they are often grown in places with cool climates where vegetables must be stored throughout the winter. Our lecture and activity from here forward will focus on one food processing technique with widespread importance: fermentation. But before we dive in, I want to give a brief overview of some other major traditional food processing techniques. Traditional food systems, as we know, include so much more than plants and animals, and the ways that communities transform raw ingredients to become nutritious, flavorful, and culturally significant foods involve important traditional knowledge that is essential to these food systems. These food processing techniques survive to this day because they result in nourishing diets that have sustained communities for generations. The major categories of traditional food processing techniques, many of which are used in combination, include soaking, dehulling, which removes the seed coat, particularly from beans, germination, in which sprouting is induced in edible seeds, mechanical processing, like pounding or milling, heat and cold treatment, and of course, fermentation, which appears in possibly every culinary tradition and for which we have evidence dating back nearly 10,000 years. To give an example of how intricate, ingenious some traditional food processing techniques are, let's return to oca. Some oca varieties are very sour, too sour to eat as they are. Andean farmers process these oca varieties by a combination of soaking them in water, sometimes for nearly a month, and alternating between freezing them during cold nights and during warm days, drying them by squeezing out the liquid that explodes from their cells when they had frozen. The result is a storable dried product called kaya, which is much less sour than the fresh tubers and which has many culinary applications, like the kaya fritters on the bottom right. Recent research shows that the techniques to process kaya also result in a decrease in the water-soluble anti-nutrient oxalic acid. The important traditional knowledge surrounding food processing is what bridges the gap between raw and sometimes poisonous ingredients and nutritious food and dishes. As many of you know, fermented foods are all around us. But sometimes it can still be surprising to learn that some foods counter our expectation about whether they have been fermented or not. So take a moment to look at the foods pictured here. Which of them result from fermentation and which of them do not? My question is a little tricky since all of these foods have some relationship to fermentation. In nearly all of these food products, the main food ingredient has been fermented. This is true for the pickled cucumbers on the top left, vanilla, kefir, chocolate, salami, coffee, miso, and kimchi. But there are two foods for which the central ingredient was not fermented, even though we often think of it to have been. These are the cucumbers and red peppers, each preserved in vinegar. Yes, vinegar results from fermentation, but in these cases, the fruits in question have not been fermented. Instead, they are preserved by the acidity of the vinegar that surrounds them, and often heat-treated to extend shelf life. This is significant because preservation in vinegar, or quick pickling, has become a common replacement for truly fermenting fruits and vegetables. And this trend results in not only different and less complex flavor profiles, but also a loss of microbial diversity, nutritional quality, and traditional knowledge related to traditional fermentation techniques. So if you're excited to eat more fermented foods, always keep an eye open for foods that are truly fermented, rather than those preserved in vinegar or other additives. So what exactly is fermentation in a culinary sense? Sandor Katz defines fermentation very broadly as the transformative action of microorganisms. The general formula is this: substrate plus microbes yields alcohol, organic acids, and/or carbon dioxide. The substrate is whatever you're fermenting, and it can basically be from any food group, including legumes, grains, fruits and vegetables, milk, meat, and fish. And the microbes include bacteria and/or fungi, yeast being a type of fungus. Our job as fermenters is to create an environment that favors our desired microbes so that our substrate can be transformed into something palatable rather than not. Here's a really fun figure displaying a variety of fermented food products from different substrates. Take a moment to explore it, and you'll likely see foods from all over the world, many you haven't heard of, and perhaps some you'll now seek to try. Katz goes into detail about the benefits of fermentation. I don't want to repeat what you've read, but I do want to highlight the major categories of these and emphasize how timely they are and how nascent some of the related research is. First, fermentation preserves food over time. This is because an environment and microbial community is created that favors wanted microorganisms and disfavors or actively inhibits the unwanted microorganisms that cause foods to spoil and rot. Relatedly, fermentation does this with relatively little energy as compared to other forms of food processing and preserving, like refrigeration. This is increasingly important in our current environmental context and looking ahead to an uncertain future. Fermentation also produces what Katz refers to as edgy flavors. Lots of shades of sour and umami result from the process. Many of these flavor profiles are regarded differently across cultures, going to such extremes as food seeming entirely palatable to one person and going to such extremes as a food seeming entirely unpalatable to one person and mouth-wateringly savory to another. And of course, he describes many health benefits related to how the substrates are transformed, the impact of adding certain live microbes to your body, and the well-being impact that comes with gaining skills and self-sufficiency. I want to highlight that particularly in terms of how live cultures impact our health, Western science is just beginning to break the surface here, but it's seeming like they have an impact on everything from digestion to immune function to hormonal balance to mental health and beyond. Despite how awesome fermented foods are, they and the microbial diversity they depend on, as you read about in the Nabhan article, are threatened by such forces as our collective loss of appreciation for complex flavors, loss of traditional knowledge, and what Katz describes as the war on bacteria. Let's zoom in now on fermented sauerkraut. Live fermented sauerkraut can be difficult to find in supermarkets. Like the pickles and peppers I showed a couple of slides ago, it's often much easier to find vinegar sauerkraut in the grocery store. Or you might find sauerkraut that was fermented, but then heat treated to increase shelf life, which then of course also kills our live cultures. Sauerkraut means sour cabbage in German and is important to German food culture. But lacto-fermenting cabbage likely began in East Asia and traditionally served as an important source of vitamin C during the winter. You can, of course, learn the most about sauerkraut by actually making it, but I want to emphasize some key concepts. First, going back to our general fermentation formula, in the case of sauerkraut, our substrate is primarily cabbage, but other Brassicaceae vegetables, and sometimes carrots or beets can also be added. And our favored microbes are a group of bacteria called lactic acid bacteria, which are bacteria in the taxonomic order Lactobacillales. These bacteria are found naturally on the surface of vegetables. Our major work is first to choose delicious, good quality vegetables, and second, to create an environment that favors lactic acid bacteria instead of other microorganisms that would cause our vegetables to rot. Characteristics of such an environment are first, that it's anaerobic. We create an anaerobic environment by keeping our vegetables submerged in water. Where do we get this water? We draw it out from the vegetables themselves by squeezing them. Next, the environment is salty. There is some debate about the degree to which salt is actually needed, but it seems to inhibit the growth of many microorganisms. It also keeps our veggies crisper, helps to draw out water, and after a certain point, the amount you add just depends on your flavor preference. And last, to the extent that it's possible, we try to keep the temperature around 60 to 70 degrees, which allows for a good pace of fermentation, and again, favors lactic acid bacteria over others. So as you make sauerkraut or any other fermented food, keep in mind the environment you are seeking to create, and this will help you to understand each step of the process and how to best care for your ferments over time. And thank you for watching this lecture on traditional food systems and food processing.